you can't hear me, go like this. And I'd like to start by reading a poem about the immigrants from my own family. Sleeping in the old bed where my grandfather and his fathers before him were born, I lie down in the flowers of an old tapestry and put my face to the old designs and sleep myself back into sleep. The family patterns hold me. Awake, I trace the lineage back again to my face and hand and see the family lines flower on my skin. I lie in a heraldry of grace and simple kin. I'm going again to Norway. Probably this will be my last time with my nephews and nieces and my great-nephews and nieces. We're going to see that it's still in the family after 500 years. It's an old place up above Selja. I want to talk about the education of the daughters of the Norwegian pioneers especially, but I'll be talking then about all of the education that they were involved in as they came to this country and then settled. And as I say, this is not just about Luther College and the Norwegian Synod. You could tell this story about almost any immigrant group that came to this country, how they began to educate their children in the language of the past as they figured out how to teach the language of the future. It was a strain and stress, as we all well know. I'm going to talk particularly about 5 families, especially their wives and daughters. I spent quite a bit of my time at Luther College in the archives, reading other people's mail. And one of the wonderful things was that the Price family, J.C.K. Price, had come to the Price Library in the late 60s with all of the stuff from the parsonage in Wisconsin where his grandmother and parents had lived. And he and Maynard Aker carried in all of these letters. And he told Maynard Aker, you know what makes a family great? Saving their letters. And of course, the historians can read them. And so the letters between Elizabeth Corrin and Lincoln Price are almost a monthly, if not a weekly, history of their lives. And Elizabeth Corrin was particularly good at writing letters that were very descriptive, like her diary. And Lincoln Price kept a diary, but she also made sketches. And although the family knew about them, they'd forgotten about them. And I accidentally came on them when I was filtering around in the archives where I probably shouldn't have been. I would never have found the book if I hadn't been there. So it sees Karen Larson, Law Larson, the president of the college, and Dietrich Augustin Brandt, who's kind of the saint of Luther College, and then Christiana Augustin York. And in some ways, when they were educating their daughters, they were educating them to be pastors' wives. No question about that. And we'll talk about these girls in a bit. Now, my lecture is going to be on primary education in Norway, and then how the young girls will be taught in the parlor, and then this community of Dundiana that we just saw a picture of, and then the Red Wing Lutheran Ladies Seminary, and the Cora Women's College, and then Luther College and co-education, and then some afterthoughts. Now, Lutherans have a real heritage of parsonage wives from Katarina Tambora. She was a nun, runaway nun who married a renegade monk, they said, and she became the kind of primal pastor's wife. And Martin Luther wasn't so sure that he should get married, but then he realized he should for an example for his followers, and also because he believed that marriage was a good thing. And he discovered how good as he came to know and love her, and remarked once on how strange it was as a monk to wake up with pigtails in his braids in his bed. So Katharina von Bora came in. She was one of the nuns. She'd been taught by the nuns how to do things. She knew how to manage the farm and hospitality and medical things. Now, actually, all the nuns were taught, how to do herbs for medicine, and they were always managing food. And then the convents were always open to visitors. So she brought that with her to the parsonage. And then when the children came along, which was a new joy for Luther especially, she realized she had to teach the children reading and writing and math, but also the faith. And then, as a pastor's wife, she had to learn how to be a colleague to her husband. And her biblical knowledge of catechism and hymns. If you read the table talk, Katie would be upbraiding him for some of his wild statements and would argue with him successfully. Now, when Linka Preuss, who is the sketcher I'm going to talk about, was a young girl, she said, I know what I want to be when I grow up. I want to be a pastor's wife. And she knew exactly what this meant and what the vocation was. Her father was a pastor, and her mother, they were all pastors' kids. They called it the Presteskap. They kind of intermarried, so they're all cousins. It's a regiment of cousins. And so she was educated to take up the family business. And when she married Herman, she said she was glad she was educated, and she was happy that she'd been sent to school by her parents. But what was it for? We'll talk about that later. But here's what was going on in Norway for girls' education. I want to just briefly mention Hans Nielsen Hauge. It was his day yesterday. In 1796, Hans Nielsen Hauge had an experience on the farm where he was plowing, and a light from heaven struck him when he was singing a hymn. And as he came to, he realized his whole life had changed. He wanted to bring the gospel to everybody and to serve his neighbor and to teach everybody the faith. And so when he went out with his evangelical work, sending letters and having meetings in small houses, he created a regiment of preachers, men and women, who could do the same. So he was an expert in mass communication of the day, but he had the same education that every Norwegian immigrant had. You learned how to read and write and do sums, and then you had the Bernalado, the top of his catechism, the hymnal, and the Bible. And he was well versed in all of those, especially Potap's explanation to the catechism. 700 extra questions to Luther's small catechism. You don't understand Norwegian American, if you don't understand the place at the top of it in the life of the faith. Every pastor taught it, and all the kids had to learn it. It was their puberty rite. But I do have a poem about Hauge. Sitting in Westminster Abbey, thinking of Hans Nielsen Hauge, Christian patriot and evangelist to Norway during the 18th century. I sit in Westminster and worship God with William Blake and Byron staring down, as priests pirouetting in their gowns of lace and ornate crosses. Bishop Laud, I am a nonconformist, forced abroad by policies of yours. I built new towns in North Dakota, added commercial nouns to the royal tongue. Still, I am on. Fancy me sitting here at evensong, moved by the gaudy rituals of lords, whose ancestors laid hands on any forms beautiful enough to see. I long to lie prostrate on stone, and utter words, the shape of fire, nurtured in prairie storms. You just have to remember him when you're thinking about Norway and education and all he did. So his educating of these pioneers who came created a strong culture, monoculture. Everyone shared the same education and faith. And by his movement, many of these pioneers got the strength and the gristle to come here. And then for Hauge, many people said they would have all been drunk. So So let's look at homeschooling and Lincoln Price's education. Her mother died when she was 10, so she lived with her father and grandmother in Ronenberg, Oslo, and learned the primary skills at primary school. They did send her to that. But she was also taught at home by her aunts and grandmother and Herman, her future husband. And then when she was 14, they had a fabulous way to take care of 14-year-old girls who are in the midst of their puberty. They sent their daughters to their aunts. And their aunts would teach them things about the house and about the languages and the literature and that sort of thing. Her aunt Rosa was up north in Oslo, and that's north of Bergen. And it's a lovely little place. She went there to be with them when she was 14. And the curriculum with Aunt Rosa was household management, confirmation. She would continue reading great literature, history, drawing, and music. And she would learn the languages, German, French, and English. She would teach her children. And there is Linka Price's picture of what it was like to be teaching those kids up in Askebol. Now, Linka Price, as a typical daughter, learned to draw as part of her lady's education. And she became a very fine sketcher of life. So in her diary, she says, "This morning I began to help about the house. And didn't I do a good piece of work? I was given a whole calf to make ready into hamburger, which I did beautifully." She's 14 years old. She has to learn these things. And her mother, Aunt Rosa, went to Bergen with her husband and left her in charge of everything. And she learned things like she'd slaughtered a veal calf, and just then someone came in with a huge fresh cod. So she had to salt the veal and eat the fresh cod because the cod wouldn't, they couldn't keep it unless they did all the salting, and she wasn't ready to do that. Her curricula was then managing servants, managing when and how things are done. There's no refrigerator or manufacturing. She has to understand how to raise animals, how to butcher them, skin them, preserve the meat, smoking and salting. She has to keep a garden for fruits, vegetables, and she has to know how to preserve them. And then she's always making clothes, knitting with wool, flax, and then doing fine work too. Then they had their formal lessons from their aunts or governesses and mothers in the parlor after the evening meal. And they went language instruction, history, writing, math, geography, and catechism. They would all sit around then after their meal, and they would work on these things. Now here's Linka's picture of what the schoolhouse looked like in the kitchen. And Linka is bringing egg doses. Any of you know what that is? Egg yolks with sugar. It was very highly prized by kids. And they're saying, Ufta, we have to learn all about the Hottentots. Now, actually, they knew it was because everyone was nice to the Zulu. Anyway, the parlor then, as they sat around with aunts and uncles, mothers, fathers, cousins, were the modern languages. They would read literature aloud. They would sing and play the piano and draw, and they would write letters to each other. And those letters became public. You would write a letter to the next family, and they would read them aloud in the parlor. So it became an art of real concentration that the women, all women of a certain class would learn how to do that. And then they would do fine handwork while they were doing all this. One day, Linka wrote in her diary, "We are to talk no language but German, but we're grandmother and all are in a good mood, we can speak easily. Rosa, her sister, is participating, of course, but Hexa is the master of us all. She is taking pride in us." So one person would be a little bit better at something, and they would teach the group. So it would be mutual teaching and studying. Now, as the girls got to be 14, they didn't send them to the aunts. They might send them to a ladies' seminary. And there was one the Moravians ran in Kristiansand, Denmark. This is the chapel. The Moravians started it. And they did a lot of schools like this. The first girls' school in Pennsylvania was Bethlehem Female Seminary, a Moravian seminary in 1745. And they shared that kind of tradition of the same curriculum as I talked about. And the Moravians said, if you teach a girl, you teach the whole family. So they learned there the finer things, languages, handy with physical activities, great literature, music especially. Here is where Kristiansfeld is. So they would take the boat from Norway, Kristiansand, and come down here. And they would live together in a group of girls, they called them choirs, and they would have an older student as counselor. This is the place where Christiane Jordan Brandenton lived. And here's the church, Moravian Church, where they had services. And Diederik Ottoson Brandt, you know, the Brandt parsonage on the campus. This is Mrs. Brandt. She was a Kristiansfeld student from 39 to 44. And she excelled in German. And I actually went into the archives here and I saw her grades. She was very good in German, but she was a bit unruly. Christiana, her double cousin, also went there from 44 to 48, and she was the most musical. And the parlor was her schoolroom, even for the congregation in East Pink and Painted Creek. Here's the curriculum: handwork, French, writing, math, history, geography, German, reading, grammar, music, drawing, and the religious services, of course, required. And they were read to from the classics while they were doing a handwork or eating meals. I would have found that irritating. I would like the classics, but during meals, I'd like to talk to the people around me. They had exercises and then, of course, with this catechism. Now, the girls' school idea had been in Norway from Kristiansfeld, and also Herman Preuss, Linka's husband. While he was waiting for a call to America, which came in 1851, he taught at the Nissen School for Girls. And he talked about girls' education at home. Linka's brother, Kalle, was the principal of Nissen Girls School until his death. So that was a real important part of their understanding of women's education. Here's Nissen, and he had the same curriculum for girls and boys except for the classics, Hebrew and Greek. The girls would tend to learn Latin. Sometimes if they had especially interested fathers, they would learn Greek and maybe even Hebrew. But be mothers, educate a woman, you educate the world. And they got the examen artium, first one in Norway. And so that's what they brought with them to America. Here's the ship on which the prices came. Mother was the homeschool for the boys and girls. Mother was the teacher. The aunts took over at 14 Northern Girls Schools, Ladies Seminary, Kristiansfeld, or Nissen. So on the frontier, as soon as they started having children, which was quite quick, 52%, the first boys were born. And so Linka, here's a picture of her from middle age. And she began teaching at home. Here she's teaching them how to mint wine in the basement. And it's kind of a funny picture, like they're telling one of them to be careful and how to cork. So it's a nice picture of how you were learning these kinds of things. And Linka drew them because it was part of life. Also, then cleaning the intestines. In Norway, you had the servant girls do that. But as she wrote at the bottom of this drawing, here in this land, the governess and the pastor's wife have to clean. So you see her adaptability right there. She understands she can't stand on her class to get things done. She has to do what needs to be done. And she's happy to do that. I love that picture. Henrietta to the right is very fancy. And Linka always has that scarf on her head. Here's the women's room a little bit later. They just have a sewing machine now. And on the side here, Linka is spinning, and at her feet are her youngest children, Doctor and Anga, and they're learning the commandments. And they're learning the fourth commandment, honor thy father and thy mother, right? When they're she's a real dramatist, to picture this. And then Christian comes in and says, I want to go hunting. See, he's leaving the women's room and going into, he'll be at Luther College next, the boys' school. I love that picture. Then Pastor Corin, wrote to his wife a poem on what the homeschool was like when they were educating them at home. I see in my mind when they were all still small, you bore one in your arms, another at your breast. And when they soon were older, we wondered what was best, what we should do to teach, to which school they would go. Your love found the answer. I'll teach them all myself. It is like a fairy tale to think of how you did. You gave them all your time, and you offered them your strength. A better faithful teacher has never yet been found. One sat upon your lap, the other on the floor, tried to find out whether his little wooden horse could stand on only 3 legs. 2 studied German, yes, and English. 1 learned the alphabet. And 1 learned to your joy that 2 and 3 were 5. First of all, you taught them to know their way. It's a lovely poem and tribute to his very capable wife. Christiana Otteson York, pastor's wife in Painted Creek, Lutheran. She'd gone to Christianfeld. She was the most musical, and they thought of their parsonage as a school. Many of the people in the congregation would come to her for teaching, and they would study in their parlor. One of the pastors that they loved from Norway had taught that they should do this in his pastoral theology book. So the parlor was her schoolroom. There is the full family. Lola Price, we'll see again, is here. Look at Lily York. They wanted Christiana to be the teaching aunt because they ran a school for the congregation. Obviously, was so gifted. She was so gifted. There's Lincoln's picture of the parsonage in Painted Creek. And there's a wonderful picture of the parsonage with all the kids playing around and getting into mischief. And I love that. Lily York Price remembered, and I love this. As dusk gathered, we sat around singing. When we sang, we all sang with our whole hearts, and Mother sang descant. There seemed to be no end to all of the hymns and children verses that my parents knew. And you see it on a hot August evening as the sun is going down. Hear this music coming out of the parlor. They could play guitar and piano, but they could sing. Mrs. York once wrote to Lincoln, I could give up all my position and work only for the school. That was Luther, had been founded by them. But that is not my beruf. My beruf is to take care of my children, Obi says. Her husband told her. So the parsonage, they realized, as the girls were getting older, was not enough. So then they had to think about ladies' seminaries. And this is a wonderful story. It's a horrible story, but a wonderful story. The Corn Parsonage burned down. I just showed you a picture of that. That burned down, and they lost everything in it. And so the Corns and their family moved to Decorah. And as they were sitting around that parlor, as they were getting used to this, Elizabeth Corn had the idea, we've got all these teenage girls, and we're at a school. Why don't we have the professors teach them? And she'd been a teacher's daughter. And so they decided to do that because they were all kind of living together. The Corners were living there now because of the fire. And so Dietrich Brandt had a place for them. And they would sit around and sew and talk in the evening. And so pretty soon, they got the idea for the school. This was the Luther faculty in 1869. 1782 was the fire. And so they asked them to teach. They were teaching from 6 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. Would you teach in the evening? Yes, they said. So they all took lessons from them in the evening, and they studied during the day. And the south wing of the Lithuania was being built at that time, and so Laura Larson was terribly busy raising money and having that done. And the Brant Parsonage was where some of them lived, and this was the place where they sang and spent evenings together. The Brant family got from English literature, composition, history, and piano. Peter and Nils Brant. Here are two of the professors, Severs and Jacobson. Jacobson died of exhaustion, not from this necessarily, but just from all the work. He had to get consumption. So Larson taught Norwegian to the girls in the evening. I mean, teaching, you give out a lot of stuff. Yeah. And you can't get it back until the summer vacation. Yeah.
When did they sleep? Or did they sleep?
I don't know. These letters then to Linka from Elizabeth Corin describe the school quite clearly. And Rosina, Linka's oldest daughter, was a student there, and she wrote home, and those letters are saved too. She was a handsome, typical Price. She took French, Norwegian, history, writing, geography, and they sang together. So the first SATB choir at Luther College, which was a men's school until 1934, was this one. They partied together and dated. They didn't study with the boys, but they partied with them. And they fell in love with each other, and that's where lots of families started. Lilla York, Price, she studied piano. She was very musical. She did the same thing. She was courted by Christian Price, and she went later to Milwaukee to study further in music. Now, Herman Amberg Price said, this is fine what we're doing here, but we can't expect these poor people to do this teaching. We need a girls' school like we have in Norway. And it should be in Red Wing. Well, he was responding in some ways to B.J. Moose of Moose versus Moose, if you read the book. I have comments on that too, but I won't give them here. He had started St. Olave's School, and there were men and women there, so there was a co-education. And Laura Larson's girls attended that school. But they said, we need a women's ladies seminary. And so in 1889, Pastor Durgo of Red Wing said, we're ready to go. And this would be a place where ladies could be taught to be successful mothers, pastors, wives, and leaders. Ladies, because that was gentle women. It was important to have them be cultured. Here's what it looked like in Red Wing. It was a very gracious place. But just as they were about to build and go forward, Luther's main building burned down, 1889. So then all the efforts of that group, the Norwegian Synod, was back in replacing this building. And so they kind of stopped the Red Wing Ladies Seminary. But as they were rebuilding, they said, should we rebuild in Decorah? Should we go to St. Paul, or where should we go? And then, if we rebuilt, maybe we could introduce co-education. Larson had taught girls, but he didn't want to do it now. So he mixed it, and they rebuilt in Decorah. So it was still just a boys' school. Here's what the place looked like in 1894. It's a really, just look at it. Corin gave the dedication to sermon. To be a mother, think of the effect of a mother reading scriptures to her son, how much fruit that bears, rather than a woman who is tempted to elbow her way forward through strife and rank in the world in order to receive one of the positions into which so many women feel is their place before the little home. No, you can say you don't like that, but the effect of a mother, you have to think about parenting now, because mothers and fathers have left the home and the kids are all alone. I think it's a serious question. They called it a factory in speeches like the Gettysburg Address. And then they had a real conservatory of music, piano, pipe organ, vocal, culture, solo recital each year. I love this picture. These girls going to church. This is the glorious picture. They had to be kept very closely because parents sent them sometimes wild girls that have a disorder. Getting a girl getting pregnant was a tragedy for the family, for the girl often, because she would have to marry the cad who got her pregnant, and sometimes they worked out. But anyway, that's what they really were most concerned about, making dancing or sex. Here's another group, and this woman is Iggy Marcus. She was raised in the Iggy cabin where Mrs. Thorne and the Thorns lived. And her husband baptized two of my great aunts and uncles out in Wilma near Norwegian. But then he died and she were working. Well, then, 1920, Reverend Wittenberg Seminary burned down. There were two fires, one they caught, next they couldn't. We think it was a disgruntled student who successfully started the fire. Because they were going to have graduation. And they did it in front of the ashes. They did think about moving it to Luther Seminary in Hamlin, which is by Como Lake. And they thought about it for a while, but pretty good President Stu didn't go for it. So they made the decision not to rebuild, and they knew that most men's schools were becoming co-ed during this time for financial reasons. And so the women added the numbers, and they had larger enrollment. Clarksburg did co-education at 21, Oak Grove Lutheran Ladies Seminary in Fargo went co-ed soon after that. So the question of their daughters, where should they send them now? To St. Olaf, Concordia, or Augustana? Or if you're a Luther person, that was an awful decision. Could Luther become co-ed? Well, it was a men's school that was getting suits ready for being pastors, and they were only getting women pastors at the time. So, what were they to do? President Oscar Olson, during the brilliant 20s, roaring 20s, was for it, and he wanted there to be women there because it was the thing to do, he said, but it was also, you could see the economic necessity, but in order to do that, you had to change the curriculum. So it wasn't a pre-seminary course. J.C.K. Price, O.J.H. Younger brother, was the General Secretary of the Board of Education of the Norwegian Lutheran Church, the ALC. He opposed Olson, and he wanted boys' education to make them manly. And how you did that was baseball and the classics. Baseball was an American sport, but you taught them the classics, and they became men, and that was a big thing for JCK, and it was part of the classical tradition of Luther. Over your president of Luther in 32, I can't imagine a worse time to move to an absolutely broke place that you have to raise money for in 1932. He knew that they needed co-education, and the financial state was dire. And he helped start a women's college in Dakota that the Luther College professors taught at. This is the Weiser College. And by 1936, the church convention talked about this question because they had Augustana, St. Olaf, Concordia, Luther, all on terrible situations. What should they do? And they had a couple of ideas. They made a proposal that St. Olaf and Luther merge. That aroused the Luther graduates, and they raised their money to pay off the debt. Then they made an extreme proposal. Luther Seminary went to Decorah, Luther College at St. Olaf merged in Northfield, and Concordia and Augustana become junior colleges. Well, that got people riled up all over the place. So they talked to J. Oscar, let him solve it after Civil War almost broke out. And then they suggested bringing back Red Wing Ladies Seminary, but there was strong opposition to women at Luther. They celebrated the 75th anniversary in 1936 with co-education. They passed the resolution, the church supports 4 senior colleges, they shall be co-educational institutions. And O.V.J. York Price, speaking at Luther College Club, said that when they changed the curriculum, they were able to offer women a degree. And that was really important. And so I wondered about that. And then I read something by Walter Ahn, who said that this tradition of classical education down through the West was the fact that they understood the boy's education was a puberty rite, and in that puberty rite was hazing and difficulties that you had to go through, and you communicated in this heritage of a past and a setting which toughened him and guaranteed his guarding the heritage for the future. And if you think about those fierce boys who became men, they knew that heritage and they were fierce about it. So the association of Latin with a toughening environment of the puberty rite type was sufficient to keep the Latin classics in place at Luther. And it was still a man's study, but now they had girls there. There still is a good argument to me about separating education for boys and girls as they grow up. My niece teaches at a girls' school, visitation in Mendota Heights, and she thinks it's wonderful not to have girls be bothered by the boys. So the irony here is the boys' education actually changed the most. The girls had pretty much been taking that curriculum since. And so David Nelson, the historian of Luther, said that this female group really was with a certain fluttering vagueness and elusive fragrance of femininity veiling its hidden strength, which nevertheless hinted at future developments that neither the devotees of the classics nor the old synod nor the shades of Walter and old Missouri were able to stop. That's why I call it unstoppable. And they it saved the college during the Second World War. They had these women now, as the men all went to war. And there were some ironies and surprises that I want to finish up with. Linka, this is a wonderful thing she wrote about herself with her brother in Norway, and they're attacking Herman for saying slavery was not a sin, it was an evil, but not a sin in itself. And her brother says this is pure sophistry. It's about us not. Your wife is a better theologian than you. So there's a lot of hidden in that. She's saying that she's against slavery, and she's been arguing for it quietly. Herman Price watched the women's rights campaign. He opposed it with all his heart. Said we must oppose this. He was for a girls' school. As Linka's health deteriorated, she heard more and more about this girls' school coming. This is her death mask. I think it's a beautiful thing. How she would look after her death. Laura Larson and Ingrid Arstrup, their daughters were successful and ambitious. Hannah became leader of the American Scandinavian Foundation. Karen Larson, professor at St. Louis. Marie died on the mission field with her uncle, the Ostrups, in the Quadluzo area. Here's Karen Larson, very imposing. Corin Sermon, the commitments to be educated be mothers or caretakers of their parents. He was thinking about that. He was pretty old when he said that. His daughter became preceptress at St. Olaf, taught music and so forth. She was also at Red Wing. She married Christian Mesa, who had a nice, interesting article on what does God say about this? Well, it says they're women places at home. Well, their daughter got a PhD at the University of Chicago and taught in the English department forever and was a real character. Yeah, Mary Lou Moore, one of our very good departed friends, had her, and she had a real flair, this woman. And then this kind of interesting, the great granddaughter of Lincoln Christian was a pastor's daughter, Herman Price's daughter, and a pastor's wife, Jonathan Price's wife. And then she got a classics PhD. All of that tradition sort of comes together in her. So, all these men have these theological debates that filled libraries, and I've read a lot of those debates, and I'm fond of those debates. I understand them. And you knew the colleges by the theological stances of their leaders. Luther was Orthodox, Oxford Pietist, St. Olaf, Anti-Missouri, Concordia, mixture, and Artstown kind of practice. But what we read are the diaries of Linka Price and Elizabeth Corn. They left a legacy, I think, that we have to say that is still alive and well. People are still reading their works, and they were happy in their vocation as pastors' wives. Linka sketched the world and created images that we don't have or wouldn't have without her. And Elizabeth Corn left us her diary and her many, many letters. There are books now of those letters in Norway. And when they created for it, they created for us a world. If you come to this part of Minnesota and talk to kids, they know they have a past. I was teaching writing once to a bunch of high school kids, and all of the Cora kids, you could tell they were from the Cora because they would write about places, foliage, and names. They had a sense for the tradition of the place. So we're reading their work, and it's amazing that it's the Winsfield things that continues to shape and inform us as we look back. So there they are. I've spent my life with them, and it couldn't have been richer.
Could you go back one slide?
So I'll take questions.
Jasmine, could you go back one slide there?
Okay.
But the irony was just about revealed.
This one?
The women's view of things that continues to shape and inform us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, you can't get a better letter writer than Elizabeth Corn. I had someone paint that picture of Elizabeth Corn, and it's on my living room wall, and I look at her. She was no one to fuss with. She saw clearly all kinds of things, but she wasn't a gossip, and she wasn't critical. The only time she was critical of anybody was when one of the leaders of my tradition came to visit them. She couldn't stand her. Usually she has very veiled ways of saying things, like the one guy from Big Canoe. She wrote to Lincoln and said, "Kanske du har den ära att känna. Maybe you would have the honor to." It's not, you can hear it scathing kind of. You wouldn't hear that at all.